Okay, hello and welcome. I'm Jenny from Boswell Book Company, a Wisconsin-owned independent bookshop located on Milwaukee's east side. Come visit us. We have lots of books for kids and bring your grown-ups because we have lots of books for them too. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome schools from all over Wisconsin. I'm so happy that Boswell can host events like this where we can feel like a community, no matter where in Wisconsin we live. Today, author Gary D Schmidt is joining us from Stratford, Ontario, Canada, where he is attending a Shakespeare festival, but he's taken a little bit of time out to talk to us about his new book. Gary is the author of 40 or so books, most of which are for children and middle grade readers, a few for young adults, and a bunch for academics, which is another way of saying they are for professors. He has been awarded a Newbery Honor for two books, including The Wednesday Wars, and a National Book Award finalist for OK for Now. Gary, welcome to Wisconsin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me in Wisconsin while I'm in Stratford.
You're
That's a good
welcome.
trick.
Yeah, we're so glad to see you. So,
Good to see you too.
congratulations. Today
Thanks.
is the on sale date for your new book, The Labors of Hercules Beal.
Yes.
Here is a picture of a few of the other books you've written. I think a lot of us would be interested to find out how an idea that you have in your head gets made into a book.
Oh, thank you for showing all of those. It's rare that I see all those books at the same time.
Don't they look great
Um,
together?
yeah, they actually really do. How cool that is. Um, Books start out in a number of different ways. So Wednesday Wars, for example, is mostly true, though it's fictionalized. And I just started out with the problem of that book, which was that on Wednesday afternoons when I was in sixth grade, every kid in my class left except for me. They all went for religious instruction, but I was the one that was left behind. And that strikes me right away as a kind of a good idea for a book. That just is going to be fun. Lizzie Bright and the Buckminster Boy was also based on real events, but the idea for that was really a true story of a group of folks who had come up probably from the Carolinas to escape slavery and ended up on a small island in Maine where they started a settlement that lasted for about 150 years. And so there again, it just feels like the idea is really, it's almost like given to me, right? Trouble is more of about a kid who discovers that it's no matter how wealthy you are, how positioned you are, how powerful you are, maybe that doesn't ensure that you're not going to be in trouble somehow. And there's real trouble for that. And so that idea came from a meeting with some kids in Concord, Massachusetts. So yeah, there's a lot of things that get around. You just have to be willing to recognize that this is the possible beginning of a book or the possible beginning of a story. And I think that's the hardest thing. It's not so much to come up with the idea as to recognize that the idea that comes to you or the thing that you're observing is potentially a really good story. So Labors of Hercules Beal really begins with the understanding, as I'm reading through various myths about Hercules, that he starts these 12 labors, these impossible labors, start out when he loses his family. And suddenly they are gone, and he's in despair. And the gods, the mythical gods, decide that the way they're going to handle that is to force him to do all of these labors, which seem ridiculous, just crazy and repetitive and silly, but they, in fact, or save him. By the end of it, he has come out of the grief that's destroyed his family. So that's the idea, right? So what happens if that same thing is applied to a kiddo who has lost his family? What would happen? And so that's the question that opens it up. All stories begin that way.
Would you say that most stories begin with a problem?
Most stories create tension, some issue, something that's trying to be born out of some tension. I mean, there's nothing more dull than to start a story and for like 100 pages, it's just this happened, this happened, this happened, but nothing is really a big problem, right? I mean, we don't think about stories that don't have some issue or tension. Um, any good story seems to me is going to get you into some sort of problem pretty quickly, so that by the end of the second or third page, you're recognizing pretty quickly that this isn't just another summer day, but that there are things that are going to be happening that you have to address.
So something's going to change.
something's going to start. You're on a new journey. So your character is going to start at, I don't know, point A. And by the time we get to the end of the book, your character is going to be at point B, some new thing. But what is it that makes him start that? What happens so that you have to get the kid going on that journey? And sometimes it's pretty easy, right? You move to a new town, you go to a new school. Okay, suddenly everything is up, everything is new. Or you open your door and there's someone who says, "Hi, I'm here to replace you." That sounds like a really good story, right? I mean, oh my gosh. Or a kid goes into the backyard and there's a new dog and you have to deal with it. So something happens that you have to deal with early on in the story.
I forgot to mention, teachers, if your students have questions for Gary, you can type them into the Q&A, and after our conversation, I will get to your students' questions. So let's see. It looks like you are lucky enough to have someone who lives in your house that you can bounce ideas off of. So who is this? Who is this friend who seems
This
to be
is
very interested in what you're telling them?
absolutely.
Mm.
This is my dog Bingley. Bingley is a border collie, and border collies, unlike most other dogs, border collies direct you with their eyes, right? So if you ever watch a border collie, even herding sheep, which is what they do best, it's not that they're going to bite the sheep, but they direct with their eyes, and they're so demanding, like pay attention to me or do thou this or whatever. And so that is very much like Bingley. He's pretty young here. He's just about 1.5 years old. But you can see that his eyes are so focused. And right now, what he's doing is telling me, okay, get off the computer, go outside. We're going to throw some frisbees. We're going to run around the fields. This is what we're going to do. I don't understand why you're not doing this immediately. And it's very, very clear that all of these things are going on in his head. I'm actually in this picture, I'm actually in a Zoom just like this. So he has come to stop it. And he is, going to demand that this is going to happen. But fortunately, he is about 300 miles away right now. So he's not going to be able to interrupt us for this one.
I would say unfortunately, because I think all of us would love to meet him.
Great dog. We've always had border collies. Usually we have two. This is the first time we've only had one. And he's just terrific, smart, fast, quick, just great.
So this is not Gary's actual computer. This is a joke that I found on the internet about writers and editing. And so tell me, how many drafts do you usually go through before you have a finished book?
This is great, but it's nowhere near enough on this sheet. It's incredible. Some people, I mean, people write in different ways, right? So some people can write through a whole draft. They blow through a whole draft right away. So Donna Jo Napoli, for example, who writes brilliant books, does a whole draft right through in about 6 weeks. I hate her. I mean, it's just unbelievable that she can do that. And then she takes time after that, of course, maybe a year and a half, 2 years to rewrite and to rework the book. There's others of us who are not nearly that fast. So I am not, for example. So what I tend to do is I write 500 words a day, which isn't very much if you think about it. 500 words is about this less than 2 pages. So every day I do that. And what I do is I start at the beginning of a chapter, revise what I've done in that chapter, and then write my 2 pages. So, if I'm on chapter 4, I'm revising pages 1 and 2 of chapter 4, and then writing my next 2. The next day, I'm revising pages 1, 2, 3, 4, and then writing my next 2, like that. So I'm revising as I go along. So it isn't so much that there's a draft and then a whole new draft and a whole new draft. Every day, there's a kind of a new draft as I go through it. And that takes me, for a first draft, doing that process, it takes me about a year to get through a book. And then I've got another year or so to rewrite and to work on that and to make it good and to go back and to answer all the questions I leave myself. So upstairs right now, there's a pad and there are about 20 questions, things to think about that I won't get to until I get through the first draft. But I know I will have to get to those eventually. So yeah, I'm very slow. Even with Hercules here, I mean, really, there were revisions that were done 6 weeks ago, and the book was just about ready to be printed. And so you're just like, you're in a panic, right? Because you want to make sure that everything is perfect, that there are no mistakes. And suddenly you find, wait a minute, in one scene, he's just thrown his flashlight to the ground, but in the second, 3 pages later, he's holding it again. And you realize that you've made a mistake there, that doesn't happen. So those sorts of things occur a lot as part of the drafting, as part of the process. But it really, for this book, was up against the print deadline.
So once you've finished and you think it's ready to send to your editor, does your editor send back notes to maybe some things to change?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think writing a book is a very cooperative process or collaborative process where there's a team that's working together. It's not just the writer, but it's the team that's working together to try and make that work. Um, I'll send the text in, and they will. And for my first editor, who I was working with, would always send back a 12-page letter. It was always 12 pages. It was always single spaced. And those are the big questions. And then there would also be a phone conversation, and that would be about a 2-hour conversation. And then there would come back the manuscript itself, the text itself, and that would be scribbled all over, like the way any teacher, like I would take a student and would write all over the text. So those three things, and you then put all of that together. Maybe in 6 weeks, 2 months, you then have to respond to that. And then usually there's a letter again from the editor saying, okay, not so bad here. Here you really stunk. You should try to make this better. And you then do that. And that might be a 2-week process. And then after that, it goes to a copy editor who's not the editor, but a copy editor. And that's the person who makes sure you haven't made any dumb mistakes, who makes sure that everything is consistent, that everything is just right. In the book Trouble, for example, I had the height of Mount Katahdin at whatever it is, 5,000 feet, something. And I looked it up to make sure it was just perfect. And the copy editor comes back and says, no, 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 it's not that height. It's another height. You are several feet off, which doesn't matter very much in the end, but still it was off. And then we go back and forth in terms of who is right about that. I love those sort of things. I always try to make sure that I'm right because I'm a complete snot about it. With that particular one, I said, you know what? I stood on that mountain. I know how tall it was. I was at the top. I'm right about this. And she still won. But fine, it was okay.
So how does it make you feel when your editor comes back and says, this just isn't working?
This is going to sound strange, but I feel great because I know my editors well. We're good friends and we've worked with each other a long time, and I know that they're going to be honest with me. One of the things as a writer that you need to do is to show your stuff to write, show your things to people who are going to evaluate it. But these people should not be people who love you. They should not be your friends. They should not be mom. I mean, those are the people who are going to put your stuff up on the refrigerator. Fine. But you want people who do not love you, who are just going to evaluate this as someone who's a professional and who are smart. And I know my editors are really good readers. I know that they are really good evaluators of how a story is working or not, and that they're going to be super honest with me. And that's exactly the kind of person that you want, someone who's going to be honest and hard-nosed and say, no, it's not working. And that means that I'm going to have to figure out a way to make it work. So my very first editor was a editor named Virginia Buckley, and she would write on the side of the margin, it was always HMM ... And then she would say, this is a problem here. You could try this, this, or this. And that was her code for saying, this is a problem. You may not use this, this, or this as your way of getting out of it. She would like say these things so that I wouldn't do them. And I loved that. I mean, how many times in your life do you have someone come up to you and say, let me help you make this better, and I'm going to give you some alternatives, and I'm really smart about doing that? Not so many, right? I wish someone would come up to me
Absolutely.
when I'm gardening in my rhubarb garden and say, the rhubarb these last 3 seasons has really stunk. What can you do to make it better? Well, let me tell you. That would be kind of sweet to have that person. And I have that person with my writing.
So when you first started writing, did you actually get editing notes on paper? And do you still get notes on paper, or is everything done on the computer?
Early on, it was on paper. It is now. It's alas, it is done on computers. But I am really retro on this stuff. So when Dinah Stevenson or Lynn Polvino now write to me and say, okay, here's some issues or here's some things to think about, I always print them out. So I'm still in essence working on paper. I still actually write when the original draft is done, I still write on a typewriter. I don't use a computer to do the original drafting. So I got a typewriter when I was, I don't know, 14 years old, 13 years old, something like that. And it was an old typewriter then. It was a 1953 Royal. And since then, and for the last half century, no kidding, I've used that typewriter to write everything, everything. I can't send that into the publisher, obviously, because they would just laugh at me. Um, but I do use the typewriter for the initial draft. And there's such a pleasure in doing it. Unlike computers, the keys you have to fight with sometimes. Everything like creaks and shudders. But when you get to the end of a sentence or the end of a line, the typewriter goes ding. It's like, good job, do it again. And you bring the roller all the way back. Remember that, those days?
I
And you go.
I do remember, because when I started college, I had a typewriter.
Yeah, see, it's the reward. It's the reward at the end of the line. Ding, okay, not bad, do it again. And I love that. And we use the tools that we're used to, and the tools that are working for us. And for some people, that's pencils. For some people, it's
Right.
very high tech. For me, it's some in between those. I mean, I'm not using cuneiform tablets, but I am using this typewriter, and it just feels good to me. And recognize that even for our writers out there now, the technology that you're using to work to write with, that you will use today, is going to be outmoded by a lot 10 years from now. I mean, completely different. Everything will be different in 5 years, even. Everything changes that quickly. But I think a lot of people will still stay with what they're doing now. That's
Well,
good.
some people will stay with what they're used to, and some people who are younger will just, go with the times.
Absolutely. We'll adapt.
They'll
Absolutely.
adapt. They'll adapt really fast.
Yeah.
Um, so I visit a lot of schools with authors, and one
Mm.
of the questions students always ask is about cover art. Do you have an image in your head while you're writing of what your covers should look like? And does it ever end up the way you imagined? And on the screen here, I put two different versions of the Wednesday Wars that are very different from each other.
Yeah, really different. The first one, they aimed. I remember going to see it. There was a cover reveal in New York City, and they asked me to come and be there, which was really cool to do that. And so the reveal was to the one on the left there, which is the original cover to it. And the idea was to make something. I remember this being described that is really unusual for a middle grade book, and that is really unusual. The notion there is that that's written on a chalkboard in different colored chalk. And they don't worry so much about, at least for me anyway, because I'm as colorblind as a dog, no kidding. So they don't worry so much about colors, I think. But they wanted that effect of this being written on a chalkboard back in the late 60s. So that's what they were going for. I had no input on that. And I usually don't on covers. I had no input on the cover there. And they really liked it. And I liked the idea of the chalk thing there. And that's Holling, the protagonist, who is face to face with William Shakespeare done in chalk. But when they went to the paperback copy, they went to the one on the right there. And that's much more traditional in terms of the cover for middle grade. It's often the case that heads are lopped off. And the idea is that this means that you can put yourself there or any kid. So you're not sort of making an individual, which I've never been so convinced about, but that's the line. When it first came out, though, this is a different version of the same cover, of a very similar cover, And that one I did fuss about a little bit, and they responded because in the one just prior to that, the kid was wearing new jeans, like new blue jeans, and the sneakers were red. And in 1968, and no one here will know this but me, but in 1968, if you wore new jeans to school, you get beat up. I mean, there's no way you would wear new jeans to school. And no guy would ever, ever, ever wear sneakers that were anything but white or black. You would never, ever do that. And so in the previous one, the sneakers were red. And when I fussed about that, they said, oh, of course. And so you can see here that they fixed it. And the jeans look a little bit older. So that feels like a better one to me. But that was not mine. There are some covers that are my conception or that I get a voice in. So like Hercules Beal, for example, they did ask me to talk about the cover and to respond to the cover. And I liked it from the beginning. In the book, there are a number of different references from about standing on top of a dune and looking out to the rising sun. And that's been in my head since the very beginning of this book. Because there is in Truro on Cape Cod, there is this amazing dune. It's a beautiful, beautiful space. Just a spectacular, where Hercules keeps saying it's the most beautiful place on earth. That's kind of how I have always felt about Truro. And he's standing on top of the dune, and what you can't see or don't get is that he's looking out to the east, so the sun is rising. He's looking over the Atlantic, and just behind him, if he turned around, he would see the Cape Cod Bay, and that's just starting to wake up, right? I'm just, even as that sun is rising, it's just starting to lay its hands on the bay on the other side, so that you see the bay on your back, and you see at your back, and then you see the Atlantic Ocean in the front. It's just a spectacular place, and the whole book was always informed by that. And though I didn't ask them to do that, I didn't ask them to do that cover, I was so happy when they did, because I think that they caught exactly what I was trying to do there.
That's one of the questions I had for you, and I'm going to skip over one question and come back to it. But I wanted to talk about Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and I have a star there where we are in Wisconsin, and
Yeah,
then the other star is sort of pointing to the very most eastern part of Massachusetts that sort of sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean. That's almost like an arm
yeah,
that's waving at you.
yeah.
Um, and I have another picture of it right there, where you
Oh,
can
no go.
see where Cape Cod is. And when I was reading this book, you describe Cape Cod so vividly that it almost feels like another character in your story. So why was it important to set your book here?
In some places, okay, there's kind of a practical reason and then a more narrative reason. The practical reason is that you're sitting in a house a long way away. I live in Michigan. And so you're sitting in a house a long way away from Cape Cod. But when I was growing up, I loved the Cape, and it looms large in my imagination. And I loved being there. My grandmother lived there. I lived there. I worked for the town of Dennis for just a short while I was in college. I did work on the Cape. I would drive down from my college just to be on the Cape. There's an unbelievably wonderful bookstore called Titcomb's Bookstore in East Sandwich that I've been going to since I was 12 years old. I mean, I still go to visit them. I brought students to go to that store. So there's so much about Cape Cod that I've always loved. I love the freshwater lakes. There's not a lot, but the ones that are there are beautiful. I love to be so close to the ocean. Oh my gosh. And at the very tip, if you go past Truro, there's Provincetown, which is this really arts-oriented town that's just a blast to be in. Truro itself is the home to the National Seashore. It's a national park, and is as beautiful as you can imagine. So there's a whole lot there that just is really interesting to me. Um, the other thing, though, in terms of the story, is that when Henry David Thoreau walked down, no kidding, walked down from Concord, Mass, and then walked the shore of Cape Cod. He walked all the way to the tip, and he stopped in Truro. And at one point, he talks about standing on Cape Cod, and he says, a man can stand on the Cape and put all America behind him. What an evocative image, a stand on the Cape and put all of America behind him. And in a way, and this is a story about a kid named Hercules who is in real trouble. He's grieving. He's lost his parents. He doesn't know what his next step is. He doesn't know what he's going to do with living with his brother now, and who he is. What identity does he have now? And in a way, he has to be put all by himself with all America behind him, so that he can begin to find out who is it that he is as Hercules Beal. How is he not the mythical Hercules? He's the smallest kid in his grade. Already he's not Hercules in that myth. Who is he? And that's kind of what I'm thinking about with the cave. It's just juts out there, everything else behind you, but now you're looking forward. And he has to get past all the ideas here so he can come to his own idea of who he is. That's a sort of like almost a spiritual part of what's going on in this book.
So I wanted to ask you about that. Here's Hercules from Greek mythology, and
Yeah.
here's your character, Hercules Beal. So how did you come up with the idea to put them together in a book?
Yeah. Well, the 12 labors obviously is the unity, right? So each one has 12 labors, but you can see the one on the left, which is a great picture. That's the very last labor that he has. And in that image, here is this huge guy, extremely powerful physically. And the last labor is to take the dog of hell, Cerberus, and bring that dog out of hell to show this king. And then he brings the dog back to hell. And he's so strong and so amazingly big. He's also sort of clueless about who he is. He knows that he's doing this because he's lost his family. He knows that he has to do these labors to make that to move towards something better, but he doesn't learn the lessons of it. So that after the 12 labors are over, he continues to make these extraordinarily stupid mistakes, and he is sort of clueless. Like, for example, here's this dog that he's brought out of hell. Now, just imagine for a moment what that would be like for the dog, who has never left the darkness of hell before. He's always been in darkness. And Hercules brings him out. Did Hercules ever think for just a moment, even did it ever flicker across his head that maybe the reason that this dog is so ferocious and awful is that he's never seen daylight, that he's never breathed fresh air, that he's never seen the ocean, that he's never run through grass? Did that even occur to him ever, that maybe he shouldn't bring the dog back? That strikes me as a really interesting question for a writer. Why does Hercules not get it? And Hercules, even as you look at him there, you can see that he wouldn't think of that. I mean, he would never be he'd never even come into that thought. But look at the other guy, and they've done this so well. That dog that's standing next to him, that dog has been through hell. It's really, really an abandoned, difficult dog. So is the cat. And that's not part of the story in a huge way, but in my mind as a writer, it is. That these are both animals that have been abandoned, and he's found them. And his role is, in fact, to do exactly what Hercules doesn't even think about. That maybe part of finding yourself is to learn to be compassionate, to learn to have empathy with people who are not as powerful as you, or who is not as beautiful as you, or who is not as able as you, or who are treated as if they are powerless and you're not. I mean, maybe we need to start thinking about that a whole lot more. And that's what Hercules, how he's different. So I tried to think about Hercules, who seems to have so much power on the left, and what it would be like to have real power, which comes from affirmation and empathy and compassion, not just through strength.
I think one of the most memorable parts of the book is the story of the cats.
That was fun. I'm not a cat person, I have to say. I really am not a cat person. But we did for a while. I mean, that comes out of the fact that for a while, we had quite a few feral cats. You know, if you get a cat who comes into your barn, that cat is going to bring another cat. And very soon there's going to be a whole lot of other cats. And so at one point, this is a few years ago, we had a couple of border collies, and we had, I think at one point, 14 feral cats living out in the barn. They didn't have names, but I would bring food out to the barn. And I mean, there were 14 of there. That's a lot of cats. And they were, in general, very ugly. Like this cat here, who was missing an eye at one point. And so the idea of that came right from that. You know, what would you do if you had a feral cat that's to everyone else is as ugly as sin? Is it possible for you to have, as a kid who's lost everything, is it possible that he might look at this cat and have compassion for it? And obviously, given the cover, you can see that he does.
Well, I think we can switch over to answering some questions now
Sure.
that I see in the chat here. I'm going to move my, oh, here we go. So our first question is, how long have you been writing books?
That's a good question. I should say I'm not the guy who, like, in from infancy knew he was going to be a writer. I know there are people like that who are really, really smart at that and who have begun writing, early on. Like, these are the people who write poetry, when they're in fourth grade. They keep journals and things like that. And that was not me. Um, so the very first book I wrote was I was in my later 20s, like 28, something like that. So I'm 66 now, so almost 40 years. I've been working at this, but it did not start early on.
So another question, tell us what you're working on now.
Writing, I've just started to do this more than I have ever before. I'm really enjoying working with other writers to do the same, to do work on one story. Um, and so I've finished an anthology with Leah Henderson, and that's a collection of stories, and that's called, I should know the title, right? Um, it's about minor superpowers. A little bit super is the name of the book, and each of those stories is about a middle school kid who has a minor superpower. Like, you always smell good, or on Thursday afternoons you can fly for an hour, or you're invisible on Tuesday mornings. But I mean, it's just something really, really minor. So each of the stories has done that. So that book is done and will be out within a year, I suppose. I've done a sequel to a book called Orbiting Jupiter. That'll be out in a year. And that's a much more serious YA book. The book I'm writing right now is one that I'm doing with a guy named Ron Kirchie. He's a brilliant writer, just absolutely brilliant. And the idea is, this again goes back to Greek mythology. A kid who's killed in the Peloponnesian Wars. So it's, like 400 BC. And in all that time since, he's been in Hades and he's been trying to escape. And so one day he finally gets past Cerberus, and he crosses the river and he heads up through the darkness of Hades, and he sees a bright white spot. He opens the door at that white spot and walks into the seventh grade boys' room of a middle school in St. Paul, Minnesota. And suddenly he is today this ancient Greek guy, but he's now a seventh grader still. And because that's when he died, he is now today in America, middle America, and he opens the door to this guy who looks at him, and he's this shade, this soul from ancient Greece. So it's the story of how he's adapting to his this new world, this America, which he's never even heard of. At the same time that the god Hades has sent a demon after him. So there's a chase sequencing going on, even as he's trying to adapt. And it's fantastic fun. I've never done quite a book like this. And it's really good to write with Ron.
So do you have a favorite book that you've written?
Good. That's a really good question. The sort of standard answer that you're supposed to give to this, and I bet Jenny has heard this a million times to this question, is the book that I'm writing right now. And in some ways, that's true, because your head and your heart are in the book that you're writing now. And so that is, in a sense, your favorite. I think if I had to choose one of those, I'd go back to a book called Mara Stories. It's a book that's set in the Holocaust. It's When I was growing up, the stories that I heard about Holocaust were not the witness stories like Anne Frank stories, but they were stories that were folk tales that were done by the folks who are literally dying in those camps, and were trying to preserve stories. They were amazing. They were incredible stories. And I never saw them published. They were always oral. That was puzzling to me because the stories are so important. And now that so many Holocaust victims are passing away, it seemed to me, oh, I should write these down. Otherwise, the stories will simply disappear. So it's a collection of about 20 or so folk tales from the barracks of the Holocaust, truly told during the Holocaust. Um, I wrote that years ago. In a way, I wish I could take the book and rewrite it now. I think I would do better at it than I did back when I actually wrote it. But you don't get to do that. It's just not in the cards. But if I think that's a really important book. So I'm not sure if it's a favorite, but it's certainly really important to me.
And do you have a favorite line or a quote in your latest book, The Labors of Hercules Beal?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I think maybe I would simply say there's a repeated line when Hercules goes up to the top of the dune and he's looking out. He always goes at dawn. Um, is always there at dawn, and I'll tell you the story of why it's at dawn. And he stands at the top of the dune, and he says, as the sun just rises, "Good morning, Mom. Good morning, Dad." And these are the parents that he's lost, but he's using that moment as a way to keep connected. For me, it was, as I told you, I'm completely colorblind. I don't see any colors at all. But if you climb up into the mountains, at least on the East Coast, I'm not sure how this would be on the West, but at least on the East Coast, when you climb up to the mountains in, say, the Catskills or in the White Mountains of New Hampshire or something like that, at dawn, when the sun just comes up, just for the very first time, the first little inkling that comes over the mountains, the first color you see is a bright green, only for a moment. It's almost like a flash. And I was told that and went up with some friends once and um, watched to see if that would be true. And if I could see it, because I had never seen green. And that moment when the sun really, we were all awake, we were all watching. I think they were watching me to see if I would respond. The sun came up and I saw it. I saw that color, at least what I think is that color. It was incredible. I mean, I cried because I'd never seen that before. And so anytime I was up in the mountains since after that, no matter who I was with, I always got up before dawn and I would watch until the sun came to see if I could see that color again. And it didn't happen all the time, but every so often it did. And so I just took that feeling of what that meant to me, that incredible moment, and put it into Hercules. So when he's saying, good morning to them, that's an incredibly emotional moment for him. And it is for me too when the sun comes up. And I took that emotion and gave it to Hercules there. So maybe that's the most, for me, the moving line. I can hardly say it without almost wanting to cry. That's an incredible, an important line for me anyway.
So it looks like on the cover of the book, there are some constellations. What are the importance of the constellations in the book?
Yeah, so much of Greek mythology is reenacted in constellations. I mean, the way we teach them even. And I'm one of those guys, maybe there are others out there who can be taught the constellations time and time and time again, and then still not remember them. And it drives me crazy that I can see it when someone who knows the constellations can show me. And I go, oh yeah, there I go. That's absolutely there. But then 3 nights later, if I go out, I'm just completely, I can't see any of them. So Eric Roman is the brilliant illustrator. I was with him once, and he knows all these constellations. And so he's showing them to me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there it is. Of course, of course, of course. And I'm trying to remember, but I can't. No matter what it is, I still can't remember them. But that's what's going on there. So Orion is the one that most people know. Most people can go out and find the constellation Orion in the wintertime. And it's sort of, you look at the stars and they're retelling the story. So for Hercules there, he's looking up, and the story of something that happened, Hercules, 4,000 years before, when he's looking up to recall Orion or Hercules, whatever, he's reenacting exactly what someone did, a boy his age, 4,000 years ago. I mean, that's pretty amazing that you could evoke that. I think it's one of the reasons that the Rick Riordan series and his are fantasy series, and this is realism, but his fantasy is so extraordinary because the stories that he's talking about have been told for 4,000 years, most of our recorded history. has those stories in it. And it's stunning that we can do that today. It's just kind of amazing. I was up in Alaska a year and a half ago, and I was told that the stars would be so incredible that you couldn't believe it. And so I thought, all right, this is my chance. I mean, they're so vivid. And so I was late at night. We went to bed, and the guys told us, the people in this place told us, don't go outside at night because there's bears that roam the island. So don't go out there. And we were in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. But I couldn't help it. Late at night, I got up well after midnight, and I went out into the pitch black because I thought that'd be the best time to see them. And no kidding, Jenny, the stars were so thick. There were so many that you couldn't pick out the Big Dipper because there were so many stars. And afterwards, when I talked to them about this, they said, yeah, a lot of the myths, a lot of the stories about the skies and the stars are in from Alaskan culture are in fact stories about the black spots where there are no stars, because you can connect those, but there's too many stars to connect otherwise. I was just completely blown away by it. So yeah,
That's
I
a
was
great
real
story.
happy. Isn't that great? I mean, that
Yeah.
you tell stories about where the stars aren't because there's so many stars. And of course, the whole time I'm thinking, I better be careful that there may be a bear roaming around here. So I had to consider that as well.
So what do you do if you start a story and it just doesn't work out? Do you have any, what they say, books in a drawer that will never see the light of day?
Oh yeah, I mean, it would be silly to say not, right? I mean, all artists, all writers, all painters, all sculptors have pieces that you start and you just go, no, no, that isn't working. That ain't gonna go. I once started a book on the Wizard of Oz. I was going to retell it from the point of view of Toto the dog, until I realized this is really stupid. I mean, he starts out in a basket. He doesn't even see what's going on. And I spent maybe a month on it until I thought, no, no, this is just dumb. This ain't going to work. And then I did a family story once. And again, it was sort of, no, no. And I think it's part of our job as writers, because it is a job, to recognize that there are going to be false starts and to say, okay, that story doesn't work, or at least it isn't working for me. And so I need to stop and go on to the next one. Now you have to give it a fair shake, right? I can't say, oh, gee, I'm just not feeling so good today. Or I can't just say, well, I must have writer's block, which by the way, doesn't even exist. But I mean, I have to be fair and give this a good try. But if after a while I'm saying, no, this just is, I'm not even interested. I'm not thinking about it. I'm not waking up at night excited about it. I don't come to my desk and I'm excited about it. It's probably the case that it's not a very fertile idea and you're just going to let it go. And, and then I remember how if you go to the Vatican and you see the statue of the David by Michelangelo, you look at that statue and you say, this is one of the most beautiful things ever crafted by any human being on the planet and all of our history. But it started as a failed project. It was a piece of marble that another artist worked on and couldn't make it work right and just said, no, forget it, and left the marble to go. Okay, that happens, and that's all right. So I don't have any stories that are, hidden in a drawer that I didn't finish or didn't like, or I did finish and I didn't like them. If I don't like it, I walk over to a wood stove. We heat our house with wood. I walk over to a wood stove. I open the grate. I throw in the galleys, and they're done, and move on to the next story.
I think that's a really interesting story, and I didn't know that about Michelangelo's David being a piece of marble someone else,
Right?
put aside and decided not to work on anymore.
Isn't that
And I
amazing?
actually think your idea of Wizard of Oz told from Toto's point of view, inside the basket, he's just hearing what's going on, he's not seeing it. I think that's an excellent idea, and I bet one of our friends could take that and run with it.
Maybe so. That would be great if someone else, if one of
Yes,
you is listening and want the
right.
idea, it's yours. Here it is.
Uh,
It's absolutely yours. I hope it works.
I think we have time for one more question, and someone is wondering, is there something that you're reading now or something that you're really excited to read soon?
Yeah, I just got two new books. one you're going to think is a little bit silly. For years I've been teaching the poetry of John Donne. He's this great poet from the 17th century. It is, if you're not in high school, or you're before high school, do not read him now. It'll ruin it for you. So give him a chance. Give yourself a few years, and then let yourself mess around with John Donne, and you will. He's so brilliant. You just can't believe it. What he can do with language, no one else has been able to do. So I got a new biography called Super Infinite. Isn't that a great line? That's the title, Super Infinite.
It is.
And it's this biography of John Donne. And I've known the major ideas behind John Donne. I've taught his stuff for many years. And it's I can't tell you how brilliant this book is. It's just extraordinary. Every sentence, it's like it's sparkling. It's so brilliant. So Super Infinite, but it's an adult work. And then the other book I just picked up, you might know the title, Jenny, is Tobin Anderson's new one, Elf Dog and something.
Oh, I know the book you mean, but I can't think of the rest of the title either.
Oh, I hope he is listening. It's M.T. Anderson's Elf Dog and something. And everything he has ever done his whole life has been so brilliant. It's anything you pick up is wonderful. So I picked this up and I read the first 2 or 3 pages and I go, I can't read this now. I can't read this now. It's just too good. I have to finish the Donne biography or I will go to this and I will never finish that biography again. So it's sitting up on my nightstand right now. And as soon as I'm done with Super Infinite, I'm going to be reading Elf Dog. And just the opening pages is you just go, oh man, he can do anything he wants with stories, anything he wants. So those are the 2 that are working on right now.
Well, we're going to let you get back to watching Shakespeare's plays.
Okay.
But thank you so much for visiting us here in Wisconsin briefly, and we hope to see you back here in the state in person sometime soon.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Jenny.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
Thank you,
Bye,
folks.
everyone. Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and have a wonderful day.